Reggie here, your friendly neighborhood bodybuilder and comic book collector, and I want to welcome you to another one of my videos. This video is a collaborative one that I am doing with my buddy Alec from Whitewell Comics. He and I started having a philosophical discussion a few days ago regarding 9.6s and 9.8s. And in our discussion, we went around and around discussing various things and debating various things. We discussed from a grading perspective, what are the differences between a 9.6 and a 9.8? We discussed scarcity and rarity and whether those things went into account for the higher price point that may be seen with a 9.8 versus a 9.6. And the conversation went around and around, and we decided ultimately that we were going to take our own guidance in that we were going to do some research so that we could have some facts behind us as we continued our debate and discussion. And we decided that we were actually going to divide up the research responsibility and the report out to the community into two different videos. One that I would take responsibility for and one that he would take responsibility for. From my perspective, what I decided to do was to look at what the grading services say about the differences between a 9.6 and a 9.8. For his part, Alec is going to evaluate how the differences between those two translate into value. What does a 9.6 say that it's worth and what is a 9.8 worth, and how meaningful are the differences between the two? My hope is that you will take the time to watch both parts of these videos. And the reason for that is, in the end, by watching both, it will allow you to make a more informed decision regarding whether you want to buy a 9.6 or a 9.8 if you are considering buying books at that high of a grade. But that's what this is all about. It's about us doing a little bit of research, offering up a couple of things for you to think about and to consider. There's a good chance over the course of this video that I may use terminology that may be foreign to you, especially if you are new to comics or newly returning to comics like I was a little over a year ago. So for you, I've created a playlist in which I highlight some commonly used terminology that comic book collectors throw around all the time. I look at things like spine rolls, spine ticks, non-color breaking, folds, creases, etc., etc. So if any of that sounds foreign to you, you definitely want to check out my playlist. First, let's spend some time talking about 9.6s. And the reason for that is when you look at Overstreet or CBCS's website, there is a lot more context given for what constitutes a 9.6 versus a 9.8. It's very interesting that there's very little that is actually given to a 9.8, but we'll get to that in just a few moments. When speaking of a 9.6, these are near mint books that are defined as nearly perfect with only minor imperfections. Generally speaking, this type of book should have no corner or impact creases. Stress marks should be almost invisible, and bindery tears must be less than 1/16 of an inch. Now, that measurement is an important one because it's only mentioned on Overstreet and not on CBCS. So that is a point of difference between the two. Other allowable defects within this grade include slight stress on the spine. However, defects such as tape are never permissible. Now, let's talk a little bit about the covers for a 9.6. A small amount of creasing and some minor color chipping or flaking of the cover is allowable. A small amount of fading is allowed, but covers should still be glossy and reflective. In addition, the book must lay flat with zero surface wear or scuffing. Covers must be fairly well centered and firmly secured to the interior pages. The book's staples must not have any rust. The book's corners must be square and sharp with ever so slight blunting permitted. Unobtrusive date stamps or arrival dates in pencil or ink are also acceptable. As I mentioned, there is actually very little guidance that is provided regarding the definition of a 9.8. And I can actually summarize it in about 3 bullet points. A 9.8 is close to mint with few defects. A 9.8 has a better appearance than a 9.6. And lastly, interior pages of a 9.8 are almost always off-white to white or better. And that last point regarding the interior pages is something that is referenced on CBCS's website, but not in Overstreet. So as I mentioned, the definition, if you will, for a 9.8 is essentially 3 bullet points. That's what it kind of boils down to when you really look at it. So the best way to maybe think about this is that a 9.6 has a few minor imperfections, and those minor imperfections can come from a long list of imperfections. A 9.8, on the other hand, still pulls from that same list of imperfections, only it has fewer of the imperfections that is allowable for a 9.6. That 9.8 is closer to perfection than is the 9.6. But the margin of error between a 9.8 and a 9.6 might only be 1 or 2 minor defects. It may come down to 1 or 2 minor differences between a 9.8 and a 9.6. And so that's really where part 2 comes into play. That's where the video that Alec is putting together comes into play, because he is now going to translate how that 1 or 2 difference between a 9.8 and a 9.6 translates into dollars and cents. And the big question that you'll have to ask for yourself is that difference significant enough to warrant the higher price that is oftentimes seen with a 9.8 versus a 9.6? When it comes to my own collection, I am actually perfectly fine with a 9.6. I don't necessarily feel the pressure to have a 9.8. Now, there is a difference here. And the difference is that when I am submitting a book, like a modern book, for example, to be graded, I am selecting that book to submit on the basis that it is a 9.8. In fact, I am actually going to submit books relatively soon, and I may screen for 9.8s, right? And that's because modern books, in my opinion, have less margin for error, right? Because they are modern books. The books technically should be 9.8s, right? So that's what I'm going to be screening for, both here personally, but also when I send them off to CGC. That's what I'm aiming for, is a 9.8. Now, that's a little bit different versus when I am trying to buy a book. If I am trying to buy a book, I don't know, again, as I've already stated, that I would go for the 9.8, because in my mind, those books tend to have a higher price point than a 9.6. And there isn't, again, in my opinion, that much of a difference between the two to warrant that higher price. Again, this is my opinion. What's important is that you consider some of the things that I've discussed here. You take a look at Alex's video and you take that in, you do your own research, and then you decide what's best for you. As always, I want to thank you guys for taking the time to watch this video. I hope that you found it helpful.